And so, at its most basic, the work that I'm going to show, that I've shown here in the gallery is looking at preservation in an age of planned obsolescence and resource depletion. And all of this is deeply rooted in historical printmaking processes and really considering sacrificial landscapes. All right, so I'm going to move along here into into a little bit of my own history. So when thinking about place, one of the things I think is really important for you guys to understand about my own ideas of landscape and history and industry is that I grew up in this place called Petrolia in Ontario. That sounds good. Which was the first place in the world to discover crude oil. And so they had this massive oil boom in the 19th century that lasted for, well, between the 1850s until 1907. Predictably, they ran out of oil eventually, as happens with every boomtown. The reason for a boomtown, with any boomtown, the reason for its existence is to extract everything from the landscape and leave this kind of husk behind. And so, with Petrolia, they had this massive boom. At one point, it was the wealthiest town per capita in the entire world. But of course, there was no concept in the 19th century of renewable or non-renewable resources. And so, effectively what happened is that they were putting up pump jack after pump jack after pump jack, and eventually everything was pulled out. And what was left behind is a place called Chemical Valley, which is just down the road in Sarnia, Ontario, and that produces about 40% of Canada's chemical production. And that has left all sorts of environmental and health consequences in its wake. And it's now has the highest cancer death rate in the country. It is, there's an indigenous reservation nearby that has over 70% female birth rates. There's just all sorts of ramifications that have come out of this, this place that we call Chemical Valley. But I grew up in a place where most of my friends' parents were employed by the various plants in Chemical Valley. And so there was this really ambivalent relationship to the industry, where people knew that this was killing them, but they also knew that it was the only way that they could stay there, was to work in these plants and to continue to be part of this machine. And that continues today. And so it's a very, very strange relationship to the industry that everybody in the country in this region has. But one of the other things that I really think about with these is looking at the way that there's a kind of nostalgia for the kind of history of Petrolia and the lost promise that came from being this first and being a place that had illusions of glorious past. And I've often thought about how nostalgia acts as a kind of powerful and sometimes insidious force for compressing both historical and geological time. And so that's something that comes up with a lot of my work. But also coming out of this is a kind of intuitive idea of obsolescence when it comes to industry. That even growing up as a kid, I wouldn't have had the word obsolescence, obviously, but it was there. I was always thinking about it because you could just see it around you, where there was these mansions and refineries that were defunct and had been defunct for 100 years. All right, into the actual work now. So I'll say that together these experiences have really shaped my ideas around landscape and industry and ideas around these, I guess, sacrificial locations. And so I've sought out these kind of locations. And over the past decade, and including some of the projects that you'll see in there, I've sought out these kind of locations such as Gold Rush era tailing piles, gone into copper mine tailing piles, decommissioned landfills, historic flood infrastructure, and a number of remote islands to create projects that are considering this history of industry. So the first project I'll talk about here is called Time Machine for Abandoned Futures, which is based up in Dawson City, Yukon, which, how many of you guys have heard of the Klondike Gold Rush? Okay, so more than printmaking. The Klondike Gold Rush, for those that don't know, was turn of the century. They discovered gold up in the Yukon, and there were thousands and thousands of mostly men who decided to try to strike it rich by making their way up through the Chilkoot Pass, often from Seattle or San Francisco, to pan for gold. The reality is most of these men who are going up this pass, very few of them ended up wealthy at all. They often got there and realized that there was no land that they could be, or no good land left to be panning for gold in. And so many of them left empty-handed if they left it all. But what came afterwards was an era of dredging, where these large machines called dredges, which you can see over here, came in and started to basically tear up the landscape and follow these rivers, reroute them, spitting the rocks out, sifting for gold-shaped or sized particles that would then sift for the gold itself. And that has left this landscape here, which just looks like intestines in the land. And all of those, if this will come back from here, end up looking like this from ground level. And so when I went to Dawson City for a project, I immediately was drawn to these tailing piles and thought of these as being the kind of authentic ruins of the Klondike Gold Rush. There's a lot of museums, history museums with, I guess, monumentalizing the work of these panners. But I wanted to look at the history that came afterwards. But what I did when I came there is I started off with what I thought of as a kind of quintessentially Klondike activity, which is to go treasure hunting. And so I went there with a metal detector, and for 2 weeks, every day for about 8 hours, I would go through these tailing piles and try to find artifacts that had been left behind by these folks from the gold rush. And we've got a software update going on here. Okay.
It's not showing up on the screen.
Okay, good. So with this collection in tow, after 2 weeks, I brought it up to the highest peak in Dawson City, which is called the Midnight Dome, and created this thing that I call the Time Machine for Abandoned Futures, which is a machine that doubles as a restoration machine and off-grid shelter that I lived in for a couple of weeks on this mountain. And so it's based on the architecture of earthships. And so earthships, again, how many of you guys have heard of earthships? So fewer earthship folks. So earthship is a form of architecture mostly out of the American Southwest that is a kind of off-grid form of architecture for, it's a kind of passive house to some extent. So basically it has a number of innovations that are really wonderful, like rammed earth that's often inside of tires. They have a south-facing greenhouse-style window. They have these convection heating and cooling systems that come out of it, none of which require outside energy to make those happen. So I adopted a lot of those into my time machines. You can see here it looks exactly the same, except I sort of subverted them into, rather than acting towards sustainability, they were just perpetuating a kind of chemical cycle that was involved in this. And so this machine here had, forward here, this gigantic battery at the top of it, so a rooftop battery made of etching plates and etching acids. The chemical reaction between the plates and the acid was both destroying the plates but also creating a power source that would then be used to remove the rust and restore these artifacts that I had excavated from the tailing piles. But what I also wanted to do here was to then add back that history into it by carefully transcribing any information that had been lost in the restoration process, texture changes, color changes, and etch that back in using traditional etching processes to be a kind of almost palimpsest of past, present, future of this place. The next piece that you see on the wall there is called the Deep Cut Restoration Laboratory, which this is a print-based installation that was based in Lockport, Illinois, which is at this site here is lock number 1, which is part of the I&M Canal, which connected Chicago eventually to the Mississippi River, effectively as a way of pushing their sewage downwards instead of upwards, so that everyone didn't end up coming down with these various pandemics, because previously Chicago couldn't grow because the sewage was heading into Lake Michigan and then coming back to themselves. And so they did this deep cuts. They cut it deeper so it would send the sewage down. But that, of course, invited things like refineries, which wanted to pass things down as well. And so just upstream from block number 1 was a Texaco refinery that had recently closed down. And so this installation I did here was made as a water monitoring station, but also as a way of kind of thinking about that history, and as part of that, so here, in the facade of the structure, I laser etched in the entire chemical data from this library of the closure documents of the Texaco refinery. And so the refineries often will not publicly put out the, or they're legally, they have to publicly put out their environmental contamination data, but they'll do it in the most inconvenient way possible. So what they do is they find a small town library, and they will put it in a back room, and they will have it under lock and key, so you have to request to get in. You're always allowed in there, but you have to request to get into this small town library. You're not allowed to bring anything out. And so what I did was to copy down all of this chemical data and then re-engrave it into this facade, so that when you're in this laboratory, all you can see is the contamination data of this factory that was upstream there. Also, as part of this was a process of creating these little artifacts that I had found from the region, and coated them in iron sulfate, which could theoretically be then thrown into the river to refertilize the river if there was ever another spill. Hasn't been needed yet. The next laboratory that I'm going to show here is called the Laboratory of Everlasting Solutions, which was based in New Paltz, New York. But it's based on this larger concept of what would geoengineering technologies look like if they were being developed by alchemists, which is kind of an absurd idea. But I was seeing a lot of parallels between alchemy and geoengineering. So number 1, this idea of immortality is an obvious one. Geoengineering at its core is a way of trying to modify the planet and using synthetic means, but that are approximating natural processes that exist right now. And so this is very much what alchemists were doing. Alchemists were, we always think of alchemists trying to make gold, alchemists trying to find a way for the Philosopher's Stone, for immortality. But really what they were trying to do was to understand nature and accelerate it. Accelerate God's work, basically. That was their idea. And so I think geoengineers in some ways are doing that. So things like taking what happens with a volcanic eruption, where sulfur dioxide is put into the atmosphere, and it cools the planet, often by about 1.5 degrees, which is kind of what we need. They're thinking about ways of approximating that by scattering sulfur dioxide particles into the atmosphere as just one example, for instance. And so with this installation, I was trying to approximate, or trying to test out some of these processes, because they're not happening yet in open air. But also one of the things I was doing here was trying to think about ideas around invasive species, especially with plants, and whether they can be part of the solution. And so growing through the center of this structure here is the tree of heaven, which is one of the most, I guess, reviled plant species in the Northeast. But it turns out it's a really good phytoremediator. And so the reason that it pops up in industrial sites is because of the fact that it soaks up the toxins and uses those heavy metals for its own growth. And so testing out things like that with this laboratory space. And this piece right here, which is, I guess, there's a gallery scale project that's in there based on this, which is a prototype for creating iron sulfate, which could theoretically be used to refertilize the ocean, but made by taking rainwater, which sifts through pyrite, otherwise known as fool's gold, which is a historical chemical way of creating sulfuric acid, that then drips and sifts through, and then dissolves iron artifacts. And then the end result, when it dissolves the iron artifact, is iron sulfate, which could then be used as a useful geoengineering material. Far too inefficient to actually be used. I'll flip through here and move on to the next project that I'll talk about here, which is was done in the Rabbit Island Residency. And so this is, I'm going to talk about the project that's at the back wall there, the little copper fragments. But I did a residency on a place called Rabbit Island, which is in the middle of Lake Superior. It's 81 acres. I was the only one living on this island for a couple of weeks. There's no closed buildings on the site, on the island, nothing more than 3 walls. But while I was there, I also spent some time just off island mining for copper at some of the oldest copper mining extraction sites in North America. And so the Keweenaw Peninsula in Upper Peninsula, Michigan has been mined for over 7,000 years, first by indigenous peoples and then more recently by settlers. And so I went to some of the tailing piles from the mine sites, so the rock piles that are left over that are the discards that are not useful or not that don't have enough copper to be used in industry. And I went again with a metal detector to find rocks that were laced with copper, and then created these etching plates by taking those fragments, which looked like this one like this, and then grinding them down and polishing them to reveal the copper that's inside, that's laced inside these fragments. Sorry, that should happen. And then etching into them these images that were from a scientific textbook of geology textbook from 1665 by a scientist named Athanasius Kircher, who worked with kind of trying to find a bridge between spirituality and geology and science and alchemy. And so I wanted to think about the way that it was believed that metals were growing beneath the earth, that were growing within the mountains. And so each of these fragments has like meticulously etched an image from this massive textbook that he put out in the 1600s. And you see there on the wall. The next piece I'll talk about is the series of etchings that are along the sidewall here, which were done during a residency at France Masserel Centrum in Casterly, Belgium. And while I was there, I really wanted to dive into these various geoengineering proposals and to think of these as like little tiny worlds to work with. And so I made these 6 etchings based on the 6 geoengineering proposals that have gained the most traction currently. And so For instance, there's this one right here, which is based on stratospheric aerosol injection, which is this idea that I talked about of replicating a volcanic eruption by scattering sulfur dioxide particles into the stratosphere to reflect some of the sunlight back. And so here, what I did was I printed this volcanic eruption using sulfuric acid. And so when I printed it, it was invisible. And then over the course of the next decade, it'll slowly get darker and darker and darker until eventually it's completely visible. And this is, the idea of here is basically to try to think about this timeline where these technologies might be necessary to implement. And so, you know, we're not at that point right now. We don't need geoengineering right now. And hopefully we never will. But if we leave things the way we're going right now, a decade from now, these will become probably reality. And so thinking about that vanishing timeline, as you could say. All of these etchings are borrowing cloudscapes from a series of engravings by a printmaker named Hendrik Goltzius, who was working again in the 16th century. But he was a printmaker and an alchemist. And what I was really interested in with him was the way that his clouds looked very different than any other clouds that I could find. And I think it was because of the fact that he was an alchemist, that he was thinking of a cloud as being a material thing. He was thinking of atmosphere as being material. And I think that that's something that we need to really think about, and we could adopt in our contemporary 21st century context is this atmosphere here is not a non-space. It's a space that we're actively putting stuff into. And so we need to think of it as a thing and not a non-thing. But in my prints, rather than, in his prints he had various classical gods in these prints. I replaced all the gods with geoengineering technologies for these prints. And so another one here, this one is dealing with the idea of iron fertilization, which I alluded to earlier. It's putting iron sulfate into the ocean. This is the one that's been used already, not legally. There was an unsanctioned experiment off the coast of British Columbia in 2012, in which a company called Planktos dumped 100 tons of iron sulfate into the Pacific Ocean to create this artificial plankton bloom that would theoretically increase the fishery and sequester carbon. We don't know how well it sequestered carbon because it was unsanctioned. We do know that it did increase the fishery, so there's some promise there. But it was this rogue experiment, which is highly problematic. What I wanted to think about here was the cascade effects of unintended consequences that would come from an act like that. So you add iron sulfate, you're almost certainly going to have to then deal with the toxic algae blooms. So how do people deal with toxic algae blooms? They add ferric chloride, which would then probably acidify the ocean. How do you deal with ocean acidification? You add either olivine or soda ash. So I did a ring of olivine and soda ash that are combined there. And so it's basically this ring of the concentric circles of these chemicals that would be used to deal with the problem that was just created. And the last detail that I'm going to show here is that this one is based on, I guess, the most far-off geoengineering proposal out there, which is called Planetary Sunshade. So there's this proposal out there to create this giant reflective sunshade at the L1 point, which is the equal gravitational point between the sun and the Earth, so it doesn't move around so much. And the idea is that it will reflect back about 2% of the Earth's sunlight if needed. This is way off, 100 years off at least. And then what I've got in here, you can see a detail here where I've printed in crude oil 3 different congressional documents that were various studies throughout the last several decades on geoengineering and how these have progressed. The last one here, which I'll not talk about in detail, but this is an idea of marine cloud brightening, spitting up sea salt into the clouds to make them more reflective, which is far less invasive. So this print, you've got this cloudscape that's been printed in sea salt on the etching there. All right, so the last project I'll talk about here is what I was doing over my winter vacation, which is a project called Operation Havoc. And so this project was done in a place called Urda Island, which is in the Finnish archipelago, so in the Baltic Sea. And it's a really strange place because it's an island that has 8 people currently living on it. It has this history of being a former Tsarist military fortress island, and so there's these military ruins all over this island that I was on. But what I made there was this boat here that was growing a kind of geoengineered ice that could theoretically, various proposals that have been developed as a way of thickening the Arctic sea ice, because that's the most urgent, or perhaps the most urgent climate catastrophe we have on our horizon, which is that we're likely to be ice-free by 2035 during the summer. So that's coming up really quickly. Some of these other ones are far off in the distance. This one's not. Oops, I put these out of order, so I'm going to go here. But I wanted to join those ideas around these Arctic geoengineering proposals with this historical project, this historical enterprise called Operation Havoc, which was developed in 1942 during World War II by the British Navy. And it was never built, but there was this proposal to create an ice-based aircraft carrier that would be 5 times the size of a normal aircraft carrier. They often called it the Berg ship, so iceberg ship, basically. But the idea was that it would be using a material called pipecrete, which is a mixture of wood pulp and ice. And you combine these two and freeze it a certain way, and it's apparently as strong as steel and easily repairable because it's using ice and wood pulp. What they realized is that it would need a massive cooling system, even in the Atlantic Ocean, that it was just too inefficient to make, and steel processing technology got a little bit better over the course of this project. And so they went as far as making a scale model in Jasper National Park in Canada, using the labor of conscientious objectors. But after doing this pretty large-scale model, they realized this wasn't going to work, and so they sunk it. So you can now find the remains of this at the bottom of Patricia Lake in Jasper. But I decided to do my own tests and incorporate pipecrete into this new geoengineered ice so that it would remain strong and resilient as well as thickening. And so here was my test, which is layers of pipecrete and various sorts of geoengineered ice. And what I did here, actually I'll go back because I put these out of order, had this project which had various methods which took these various geoengineering proposals for thickening the Arctic ice, none of which have been tried, but all of which have been put out there. So the first one here is this idea that if you desalinate seawater, so you take the salt out of seawater, suddenly it is able to freeze at about 1.5 degrees warmer than it would otherwise. And so you take the salt out of the seawater, and that ice that would otherwise be melting will remain ice. This has been proposed as this larger project of having these strange submarine-like forms that are pulling seawater in there, desalinating them, and spitting them out as these hexagonal forms that look a little like a video game. It's very strange. But the theory in it is kind of intriguing. What you do with the salt afterwards, what you do with how you create the energy is all an open question that hasn't been resolved yet. The second proposal that I've incorporated into this machine is one for misting, pumping and misting the seawater. So basically, the air above the surface and the water below the surface are very different temperatures. And so if you were to pump that water, the warm water from below the surface, and finally mist it on the surface, suddenly it freezes above the surface because it's much colder out there. And so the idea here was to just take the seawater that I've just desalinated and run it through a pump system and mist it so that it would be freezing in these really thin sheets and then be able to freeze faster. And the third one is to scatter layers of silica over the ice so that it becomes more reflective. So these are like little glass beads that are really, really small. They're very reflective, and so the idea is that you put those on there, it'll reflect the sun back, and suddenly your ice doesn't melt so quickly. And so I've incorporated those all into that mechanism, created this geoengineered ice, launched it into the Baltic Sea, which will, in theory, outlast the other ice in the Baltic Sea. But again, it's just it's an offering to the sea. I have no idea how long that will last in there. Similar to some of the unsanctioned experiments that have been done in the past. There's no follow-up. But in this machine, that flotation system, which you may or may not have noticed on the side of that copper flotation, it's been intricately etched with these maps, which are Arctic navigation maps from the 16th century, complete with sea monsters, which were in almost all of those navigation maps. But instead of just leaving them clinical as the original maps were, having geoengineering technologies enter into the fray, and so it changes this narrative. So what those sea monsters are doing, rather than being your attackers, they are your defenders. So they're defending the shores against these geoengineering incursions. And I'm thinking of them, these sea monsters, as being that last line of defense within this profoundly bizarre project that I've taken on here. So, all right, that's it.
So do you work with teams of other scientists, and do you pretty much work alone and you do all the research on your own, or you kind of collaborate with other people in the field that you create this kind of communities?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So often at the outset I'll be asking lots of questions and there have been projects, none of the ones that are in here, but I have had projects where I've collaborated more directly with
Scientists,
with engineers. There was a little bit of collaboration in the Operation Havoc project, where one of my former students, who was a double major in printmaking and engineering, he had graduated a couple of years ago, and so I worked closely with him to develop some of the technology to make sure that it would actually function on the island, because I didn't want to get out there and realize that nothing that I did worked. A lot of the beginning research does happen solo, as you might know. Like, if you start to try to talk to those in hard sciences about these bizarre ideas while they're still half-baked, and it doesn't go very well. They need to be almost fully cooked before that conversation can start, and then you can be asking much more directed questions, because of the fact that what I'm doing is incredibly inefficient and incredibly they're not useful proposals by any means, and so the thought process is very different, and so I find often the collaborations have to almost work backwards, which is a little bit weird. Yeah.
No, but it's an interesting conversation in terms of like a think tank, like what we do in MIT, is like combining all this different. Most people think of art as so separate of science, and we create this abyss between the two fields where actually they're so connected, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing that artists have to do in that is the moral compass to some of these ideas, because there's some of these proposals, they might work, but you're not necessarily thinking of the unintended consequences. You're also not necessarily thinking about the way that people will use them, the kind of political dynamics that might come out of that, or even just the way that people might think of it as a get-out-of-jail-free card in a way of not actually changing anything, And so, sometimes those conversations back and forth can be really important.
Yeah, because, sorry that I'm one more question. So in the context that we are in here in the college, you know what I mean? And these are like first 2-year kids. We're like young. We're just starting to learn, right?
Yeah.
And there's this kind of mystification of what an artist is. Like this kind of like slap on the wall and get it done and I'm done, right? What if we could quantify, and that's sometimes possible to quantify, but if we quantify, is it important, the research component to the art, the actual physical process? So how important is that search, is that research to your work?
Super important, yeah. I mean, for me, and I was trained in a very materially heavy environment. You know, like I studied printmaking, which is a very like traditional process-oriented thing. But at this point, you know, the making is super important. The aesthetics are very important, but like none of it would exist without the research behind it. You know, I wouldn't be making anything that I make without the more larger scientific or social ideas that I'm dealing with. And so oftentimes it'll be a year of research before I even start a project. Or like with the case of Havoc, I started thinking about this idea in 2016. And it just happened in 2022. You know, it's been 6 years now of thinking about it, of researching it, waiting for the right time and place and idea, like waiting for it to feel fully cooked. Because there was like little hints of it before it came into being. And I didn't want to launch into it without feeling like I fully understood this whole landscape that I was dealing with. But also finding the place, you know? Finding this site to work in to make it happen. And a lot of the times with a lot of the projects that I'm doing, it comes from place first. So getting to a place, you can't come in there and be like, I know everything about this place. Like that doesn't work. Suddenly the community's like, no, you don't. Like this is ridiculous. Get out of here, right? So a lot of times the research is like on the ground research. So like the project in Illinois, for instance, I worked with a local group that, like, basically metal detecting society, but they call themselves a historical society. But you know, work with them to understand the place because they had all like done their own community-based historical research that was really interesting to learn from. So it's not just scientists. Sometimes it's community organizations and just like anyone I can find and talk to.
Thank you.
These installations that are on site, are you building them by yourself, or are you prefabbing them and then bringing them there?
A little both, depending on the site, yeah. So the one in the Yukon was all built on site. That was the one on the top of the mountain there. The one in
So you're planning them out then beforehand? Somewhat, like you're having to get those materials, right?
Yeah, so that was during a residency. So it was 6 weeks. So I had 2 weeks where I was doing during the day metal detecting.
Yeah.
So I started planning it out, and I had 2 weeks in the studio where I was just fabricating like crazy, and then 2 weeks up on the mountain.
And do they still stay there? You have to take them down again?
Yeah, there was that one had an agreement with Parks Canada because it had chemicals and it was in a natural environment. So they said like, yes, you can do it, but only if it's occupied 100% of the time.
Oh wow.
And so I couldn't leave. Like it was 2 weeks. I was not legally allowed to leave this thing except for one point I had to give an artist talk. So I had to come off the mountain, come down into town. I had to send someone up to meet me.
Oh, okay.
To be able to sit there and make sure that, the one in New Paltz was a little different. I did that mostly in the studio and then brought it over there and installed it. So, depends on which one.
And that's still remaining or no too?
That one was up for 2 years. It just came down a couple months ago. The one in Illinois was up for a full year and it was growing. Part of the idea was to have these invasive plants that would take over and become this kind of site of rewilding, I guess you could say, in this thing. So it became this kind of strange. After I left, it no longer was useful for any of its mechanisms, but it became this place where plants took over and became this almost romantic ruin over the course of the year. And the one in Finland, built the scaffolding for it before I went onto the island because there's no facilities to make anything up there. I did bring a torch and some gas to be able to make repairs, but the actual structure was made in advance, but then all the things that happened in it were happening on site in the Baltic Sea.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
What are some other artists that you look at or you take as reference?
Well, we were talking about Melchin earlier, so let's start with him. He's just an amazing artist, but he did a project called Revival Field that it's been really inspirational to me because of the way that it changed the game, not just within art, but within science as well, where he did a project which was testing phytoremediators in a contaminated site, so thinking of how plants can absorb toxins and help with their own growth, but be absorbing toxins from the land, which was a kind of like, it's not like there wasn't anyone doing research on this, but it wasn't popularized until he did this collaboration with scientists for this art project in which the end result was highly successful and I guess you could say was a point of proof so that scientists could run with it, ecologists could run with it, and now it's just common practice that these are the kind of things that you do when you come into a contaminated site. So I'd say that, you know, those are the kind of works that I'm often most gravitated towards with